The US has removed, apparently, again, according to Reuters, Iran-related sanctions, and that's coming from the US Treasury's website. Why would they
Yeah,
do that?
look, when you don't have adherence to your purported strategic vision or a policy process, an apparatus to help inform you, you have justification to take on a number of positions. So we saw with the MOU that was signed, that was lifted at least temporarily some of the oil restrictions for Iran to sell their oil. It also promised a number of other economic benefits, such as the unfreezing of assets and some of these other things. That should have been a seismic. I mean, that was just a complete capitulation over some of the key issues that you used to justify the war in the first place. I think a black eye diplomatically for the U.S. in a broader sense, because it shows that it is no longer, even a trusted interlocutor in terms of fomenting increased stability in the region.
This is the Global Gambit.
Welcome back to another episode where we return to the war in Iran. Now, if we'd started this earlier on in the year, you would have been seeing me posting every day frantically with streams and updates about the intensity and absolute chaos that was proliferating out over much of the Middle East and obviously in the focal point of Iran. But since sort of, shall we say, April, May, there's been more of an emphasis on the Strait of Hormuz, and then there was the naval blockade, and suddenly you had an MOU which lasted a month, and that deal was so incredible that it lasted the best part of a month, and suddenly we're back to fighting. But now we're very close to the actual deal. Donald Trump is saying that we're very close to a deal and things are looking good. But at the same time, the Americans are sort of sidelined from the Strait of Hormuz deal, which is not the deal, but still there's a deal, but there's another deal, or make or break of a deal, essentially, is where I'm trying to go with this, because I have no idea what's going on. But someone who does, and I'm very excited to hear from his perspective, his experience of managing and influencing US foreign policy and policy making, is Dr. Jason Campbell, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he's focusing on US foreign policy, defense strategy, Middle East security, and great power competition. He was also with the RAND Corporation for about 15 years. So, Jason, it's lovely to have you on. We've had quite a few staff members from the Middle East Institute now, but hopefully you're going to help us understand what the US perspective is on things right now.
Well, thanks for having me, Pyotr. I hope, I hope this is insightful.
Well, one can only hope, and viewers, of course, do follow the show for future updates on this. At the time of recording, we are seeing, as they say, the final I's being crossed or dotted, and hopefully a deal over the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Oman, but the US is sort of sidelined there. So I guess a good place to sort of start, really, is, Jason, in the past couple of weeks since we had that intensification of fighting, what is the policy of the United States? What is Trump trying to do here?
Well, I think it's difficult to say on a day-to-day basis. I think at the macro level, I think ideally Trump would like to be able to extricate the U.S. from what has been increasingly unsuccessful campaign, largely military focused, but with I think objectives that started out with a number of maximalist requirements, which I would beyond just desired outcomes, but requirements now have been whittled down over time to very tactical level, or issues that really weren't even issues prior to the outset of the war. Right now we see the Trump administration, the senior leaders talking about preventing a nuclear Iran, which has remained an issue now for a number of decades. But in the immediate term, I think the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz would be something that, even if it were somewhat of a diplomatic black eye for this administration to come to terms on something that I think the Iranians would agree with, I think that's something that they would be willing to consider, given some of the limited military options that we're seeing now, given a number of factors.
Yeah, well, as I say, I find it pretty bizarre. We've hosted everyone from sort of more dovish to more hawkish, and certainly there is a consensus that I'll put it this way. Trump seems to have the unique ability of bringing together left parts of the Democratic Party, the moderates, former MAGAs, Republicans, traditional Republicans, all to agree that this was a completely crazy idea, and has not led to any strategic benefit for the United States whatsoever. Can you find anything that will benefit the United States in this?
Not in a scenario where there is what anyone would refer to as a firm resolution. Because right now, Iran has discovered this newfound leverage over the Strait of Hormuz that was, always there in theory, which I think is something that this administration has not been as upfront about as it could have or should have been. Is that, again, you mentioned my 15 years at RAND. Over that time, participated in a number of war games or tabletop exercises that, specifically looked at what might Iran's reaction to an attack look like. And closing the Strait of Hormuz was always front and center, one of their more immediate likely reactions. And we've seen that play out here and play out in a way where the United States, for a number of factors, has been really unsuccessful in being able to debilitate Iran's asymmetric advantages. So what that means is I don't see a scenario whereby Iran agrees to some arrangement vis-a-vis the Strait of Hormuz that doesn't include some significant economic benefit. And we can call that a toll. It can be referred to perhaps as a development fund, which I think is the phrase that was adopted in the MOU. But in some way, Iran, even though its military has been degraded to some extent, they still maintain the ability to threaten the region. And again, if there's any resolution, they're going to come out of this with some significant economic benefits. And the United States right now has, I think, diminished a lot of its relationships across the region, and is going to have to, again, rethink and reset a lot of its strategy when it comes to the Middle East in general.
So does this mean that America has finally abandoned what many consider to be the post-Cold War Middle East strategy? You mentioned in the before we went live your experience with Afghanistan, and a lot of people look to the withdrawal from 2021, which was obviously based on, actually, we need to remember, Trump's blueprint, the Doha Agreement of 2020. He simply enacted it. So fingers should be pointed as much to Trump as much to Biden on that. Has that been one of the inflection points that has redefined sort of American Middle East strategy?
Certainly, the withdrawal of Afghanistan in 2021 was a hit to, I think, overall U.S. credibility. I think much more pronounced here in recent weeks and months is, again, Iran's discovery of what it is able to achieve strategically through its asymmetric means, coupled with a very expansive and increasingly capable ballistic missile arsenal. So I think with that, we've seen Iran both be able to control the Strait of Hormuz. They've conducted some very accurate strikes against U.S. installations throughout the region, most recently in Jordan. And I think that's the big culprit here, is as the United States and a host of Gulf and Arab partners are moving quickly now to address some of their shortcomings in terms of air and missile defense and even some of their offensive capabilities. That's going to reshape, I think, the nature of the defense relationships throughout the region, and certainly how the U.S. Perceives its strategic goals, particularly vis-a-vis some of its posture requirements and just its other force design for the region going forward, because Iran has demonstrated itself to be a capable foe for some of these, certainly in the shorter and medium range areas.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been saying this for a good couple of months now. The single biggest benefit that the Iranians have had is the strategic clarity that this war has brought them. Right, that the nuclear option, so to speak, is not actually a nuclear weapon. It's the capacity to leverage geography to deter the United States and risk the global economy. And while the Strait of Hormuz has been the primary a bedrock of this strategy or approach. We now have the extension towards the Bab el-Mandeb, the Houthis, although it doesn't seem to have escalated as much as some people thought. I'm quite curious what your thoughts are on those two choke points, and especially the subsequent risks to the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea.
Right. Well, again, at a strategic level, I think we've already seen the countries in the region that are able to are pursuing alternative routes that could, if not completely leave out, then minimize or reduce reliance on the Strait of Hormuz for the movement of goods. Some countries ultimately won't be able to do that. I think when you look at the Bab el-Mandab, the Houthis are indeed been beneficiaries of Iran's support over the years, but are still pretty independently saying they aren't vassals of the Iranian regime. And I think that they certainly have issues with the Saudis, as we've seen in the most recent flare up of strikes and their announced blockade of Saudi Red Sea ports. And I think that's going to continue to be a point of tension. But I don't know that they're going to continue, or I think they don't want the image that they're acting in the under the guidance of the IRGC, but for more local issues. And I think that's going to continue to burn on as a related, but I think separate dynamic as we move forward. Again, it'll absolutely continue to, as it has now for a number of years, to continue to shape some of the strategic dynamics of some of the key U.S. partners in the region. Again, is something that I think demonstrates a broader thing, is that President Trump throughout this has tried to bifurcate some of these interrelated complexities of the region, and at a time be able to say, oh, we're just going to focus on Iran right now, and that's what our negotiations are going to center on. And I think Iran has been quite astute in insisting that no, that's not how we're going to proceed here. We're going to lump in Lebanon in this, at some points Gaza and Hamas, and or the Houthis in Yemen as part of a broader negotiation, because I think it's in their interest both to keep this a fairly complex discussion, but also to be able to reinforce among some of these organizations that it is, I think, maybe lost some of its ability to influence and support over the years, and try to recoup some of that influence here, through these complex diplomatic talks.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the sort of alternative options, the options that the Gulf states have, and the Saudis have been leveraging this most of all to deliver exports through the Red Sea or whatever through the Suez Canal, but the Houthis have been putting pressure on those. So the fundamental question is, does this not permanently undermine the Saudi-US relationship, the petrodollar, everything that has determined the Middle Eastern sort of balance of power, if you like, for many a decade at this point?
Yeah, I think there is, broadly speaking, there's been some disappointment among some of the Gulf partner states, not just the Saudis. I think the seeming lack of consideration the Trump administration has had for their safety and well-being over the last number of months, and perhaps somewhat of a lack of their voice being heard on how best to, again, extricate not just the United States, but everyone from this trend towards, increased attacks, and certainly, fiery rhetoric, threatening attacks on a fairly persistent basis. So I think certainly there's some frustration there. And I think there's going to be, as we, hopefully, we'll see if this agreement between Iran and Oman comes to fruition here on the Strait. But as we hopefully get into a period where there's a little less imminent threat of persistent attacks, I think there's going to have to be, again, a recalculation on the part of a number of these countries as to their relationship with the U.S., but also what their expectations are from this relationship, from a security perspective, from an economic perspective, and even from a geopolitical one in the wake of all that's transpired. And I will say too, the other thing to watch out for, obviously, which is very influential here that we haven't mentioned yet, is the dynamic in Israel and what these elections are going to bring, either a continuation of Netanyahu or a new government entirely. I think that could have a significant impact on a number of bilateral and multilateral relations throughout the region.
Yeah, I mean, you used the word disappointment, but isn't outrage more appropriate? I mean, some of the ways that this war is entirely a war of choice by Trump. I'm not going to hold back in my absolute condemnation of it, if I'm honest. And, the risk it's posing towards American personnel, American interests, not that I'm trying to be balanced, but it's just so unnecessary, I think, is how a lot of people feel. And when the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainians, the Jordanians are on the receiving end of these intensified strikes now because Trump decided to ditch the MOU, surely it's more than just disappointment, no?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, particularly at the ground level in many of these countries, because it's become increasingly clear over these months now that simply engaging in another set of airstrikes against Iran is not having the desired impact, and it's very difficult to make the case, even now with increased threats of hitting certain types of civilian or dual use infrastructure in Iran. It's very difficult to make the case really to anyone that, we are one set of strikes away from Iran being crippled and again, begging for the peace that Trump periodically says they are, which has not been the case yet. So sure. I mean, whether it's disappointment or outrage, I think there's understanding though throughout the region that the United States as a country with its interests and objectives in the region can and hopefully will remain an important partner going forward. But even if they are, again, trending toward outrage at the current leadership and how they've pursued this war that is being increasingly obvious that it's not going to come to with the desired objectives from the outset.
No, sure, I appreciate that. So obviously that one makes one wonder about if these talks don't go anywhere. We've had a colleague of yours, Ross Harrison, on many times. We've had Alan Erie on many times, and both of them talk about horizontal or vertical escalation. I think one could argue we've seen a lot of horizontal escalation with these heightened strikes across more countries that I mentioned just now. But, what kind of escalation could this lead to? Does the US still possess, say, escalation dominance, for example?
No, I would say, in a word, I would say the right now, the viable U.S. military options have gotten thinner over the last weeks and months. And I say that for a number of reasons. We've seen numerous reports really dating back to early on in the war, as I say, even May, that the number of interceptors that both the U.S. and some of its key allies and partners have had to expend to fend off an array of projectiles from Iran, from everything from ballistic missiles to lower flying, slower cruise missiles and Shahed drones, has been substantial. And the stocks are indeed running low. We've seen more recent reports of the U.S. running very low on some of its long-range surface-to-surface missiles, the ATACMS, the PRSMs, the precision strike missiles. By again, some reports are the U.S. has expended roughly 80% of that. So from just a munitions standpoint, the U.S. it has greatly degraded its capabilities there. The other thing I would point out is that, as we saw in Jordan, where the Iranians were able to strike with precision a U.S. Housing units on a base. My whole question now is if the U.S. was going to incorporate ground forces, particularly at a level that would be required to forcefully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. You're talking about multiple divisions. I have significant concern right now that they would be able to stage such a large amount of forces in the region safely prior to such an outcome. or prior to such an operation. So I think the option of the big footprint, insert ground forces into the country at a rate that could be successful is now, if not very much in question, then completely off the table. So from a military standpoint, it's again more airstrikes, potentially against expanded targets. But from a strategic standpoint, I don't see that moving the needle in America's favor.
I think the strategic picture for the Trump administration looks pretty precarious. I mean, what is the biggest determinant right now? Is it the midterms? Is it the Israeli elections? Netanyahu's not doing very well against his more centrist counterpart. So what could be a couple of things that really call an end to this conflict? Because every time we seem to think, hopefully, there's an end to this conflict, or at least an end to the intense kinetic aspect to it, and more emphasis on diplomacy, we seem to revert. So what would be the biggest catalysts?
Yeah, I think right now, obviously the midterm elections are a significant factor here, I think, for the White House, but also I think finding a way to, if not completely halt the kinetic component of this conflict, then being able to get to a point where the Strait of Hormuz is open, and in a way where Iran is satisfied, again, with the economic benefits tied to this, but in a way that the White House can sell it as, potentially, well, this is a bilateral agreement between the Omanis and the Iranians, or this is, the Gulf states, as we know, have been, bilaterally having talks with Tehran about, the cessation of hostilities. They can politically sell it as an agreement among regional interests that the U.S. Begrudgingly abided by and called off the naval blockade. I think in the short term that seems to be the quickest way to, if not a long-term resolution, then something that could maybe get through this calendar year, and certainly the midterm elections, in a way where this wouldn't be too damaging. Now, there are a lot of wild cards there that you have to consider, not least of which would be, what are Iran's demands, even to some of these partner states, vis-a-vis, again, the U.S. presence in their countries, the continuation of their basing, at Al Udeid or Dhafra in UAE. Oman, that's less of an issue from a permanent basing standpoint, but it depends how far Iran wants to press its negotiations with these countries in exchange for the Strait of Hormuz opening. That will be the biggest thing to watch.
Right. And I mean, I'm going to reference the big elephant in the room, or effectively the dragon. Is China the biggest winner from all of this?
That's a great question. They have certainly benefited geopolitically from it. It'll be interesting to me. It's something I thought about this a few weeks ago, and it's interesting that they don't seem yet to have interjected themselves with some of the Arab partners and allies of the United States in a way that would seemingly clearly signal that they are looking to exploit, I think, some of the hard feelings against the United States from over these last few months. That doesn't mean that there haven't been some quieter engagements ongoing. Certainly when you talk about the recent announced and then seemingly canceled nuclear deal between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, obviously China as an alternative has always been a concern there. But it's absolutely something to watch. But I think just in a broad geopolitical standpoint, China has absolutely benefited from what's gone on. It's a question now for me on the extent to which they're going to try to openly exploit some of the schisms that Iran has successfully created.
But I mean, Jason, just to push you on this a little bit more, but surely the Chinese have been more involved, right? There's a lot of people are confident that the Pakistanis haven't been quite
Right.
the mediators without some degree of support or input, at least from Beijing. There's been polls recently done. America's now less popular than the Russians or the Chinese, and there was that ranking a couple of months back as well about soft power. The soft power index and the Chinese have been growing significantly, and that includes in the Middle East. So because of Trump's overusage of hard power, the Chinese can leverage their soft power to bridge that gap, or you think that's overstated?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't dispute anything that you said. And look, that to me is collectively the broader geopolitical benefits here is their popularity, is their, seemingly increasing opportunity to kind of fill again some of the wedges that Iran has created in U.S. Gulf relations. I don't know enough about the Pakistani angle here has not been, aside from that one meeting in Islamabad, has not been overly fruitful. So I don't know that I would put much weight in China being able to sort of pull the strings behind the scenes on that, because we've actually seen an increasing role from Doha and some of the mediation. But you're absolutely right. These are things where the U.S. has paid a price on the ground among the people of the region for the way it's prosecuted this war, and it continues to do so.
Right.
And China's got the opportunity. We'll see how they go about and the extent to which they go about taking advantage of it.
Certainly. No, I just think I appreciate your focus is more on US outwards, so to speak. But I think given great power competition and just the way that might is right has returned since Trump's usage against Venezuela, it's just worth considering. But I guess, before we came on air, you were emphasizing the point about a lack of policy process here. And given your time as country director for Afghanistan, and defense for policy sort of experience, what lessons, what takeaways should we be applying here in the context of Afghanistan? If the United States is seemingly getting back involved in the Middle East when Trump's emphasis was pivot to Asia, building on Obama, what should be the approach here?
Yeah, I think, so I've got an article coming out soon advocating for a return to a more robust interagency policy process. What we've seen is that the Trump administration came into office and right away fired or reassigned upwards of 160 staff at the National Security Council. Again, I'm not trying to right size the amount of staff you need on the National Security Council, but the detailees there come from the various stakeholders across the policymaking community, be it DoD, the State Department, the intelligence community, and tend to be among the most experienced and brightest of the people from their respective agencies. And they largely dispelled of many of them. They had obviously Michael Waltz was the early national security advisor. Was ultimately pushed out along with his deputy and other staffers. So they've been now dealing with what I would claim as a more of a skeleton crew at the staffing level, and you're not seeing the engagement across agencies that you normally would. And what you're doing there is depriving leadership of well thought out alternative options to consider to, again, extricate the U.S. from what has been an increasingly difficult and complex situation. And not only that, once a decision is made, these are also the people capable of ensuring that these decisions get implemented down to the working level and down to the field, which again is clearly missing in a situation where you have people like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner serving as the lead negotiators, who also have Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine on their plate. Or you have in Marco Rubio someone who's the Secretary of State, but also the National Security Advisor. So this ultra centralized sort of deliberation and decision making process, I think is not doing a service to itself by depriving it of a really capable staff that can, again, provide good options and then implement them. And I would also point out, related to that, the United States, it's been well reported, currently has, I think, over 100 ambassadorial vacancies across the world. Many of those are in key capitals in the region. There is no congressionally confirmed ambassador in Riyadh, in Doha, in Abu Dhabi. So all of these things, right now, there is not sort of a voice for formal U.S. policy and perspective in many of these key capitals, which again, I think goes against U.S. Objectives in the immediate, but also in the longer term.
So I'm just seeing here a recent report by Reuters. You may not have seen it, but I kind of want your quick reaction to it. The U.S. has removed, apparently, again, according to Reuters, Iran-related sanctions, and that's coming from the U.S. Treasury's website. Why would they do that?
Look, well, this is, again, when you don't have, again, adherence to your purported strategic vision or a policy process, an apparatus to help inform you, you have, again, justification to take on a number of positions. So we saw with the MOU that was signed, that was lifted, at least temporarily, some of the oil restrictions for Iran to sell their oil. It also promised a number of other economic benefits, such as the unfreezing of assets and some of these other things. And if you remember, the day after the MOU was signed, President Trump got in front of a microphone and basically said, well, it's not really fair of us to tell Iran they can't have ballistic missiles when so many other countries do. And when he was asked about the unfreezing of assets, he said, well, you know what, it's their money. We're going to have to, give it to them at some point. And it's just shocking that, that should have been a seismic. I mean, that was just a complete capitulation over some of the key issues that you used to justify the war in the first place. And so it doesn't surprise me now that we're seeing, again, this might be tied to, again, my initial reaction is this might be tied to the other talks going on between Iran and Oman on the opening of the strait. And this might be a concession the U.S. has agreed to enable that. But we'll have to see what happens. And again, the fact that this all might come down to a negotiation that the U.S. really isn't materially involved with is, again, I think a black eye diplomatically for the U.S. In a broader sense, because it shows that it is, no longer, even a trusted interlocutor in terms of fomenting increased stability in the region.
Yeah, no, for sure. Just wanted to sort of try to understand this, because the Trump administration are saying one thing, but then you look at some policies, and again, to your emphasis of the policy side, seem to be
here's
making
the thing: we could tomorrow see that that's been completely rescinded and blown up and denied. I mean, this is what we've seen. We saw, the U.S.-Saudi nuclear deal was signed, and there was all this criticism about it. It didn't call for, some of the longstanding, sort of quid pro quo there, that, the Saudis would normalize relations with Israel, if not join the Abraham Accords. And it didn't put some of the measures in place to ensure that, some of the safeguards in place on the enrichment. And so the next day, President Trump just announced that this is now part of the agreement, where it clearly wasn't. So again, when you don't have that, working level of professionals that are not only engaging with senior most leadership, but also with some of the partners and allies involved, you have a lot of this, constant confliction of messaging and status of where you're at on a number of issues.
Okay. Yeah. No. Appreciate you expanding on that point there,
Sure.
Jason. But I guess my sort of penultimate question is really, if Trump is going to be tackling so much, if he says one thing, but every 5 minutes it's then a redaction or a retraction and a shift, how do we know how to plan for this as allies, partners? I don't know, everyone in the middle? Like, how does one know what to feel is real anymore? What is true?
So I think largely they don't. So what they're having to do is to hedge in real time, because look, there is a very important distinction between being unpredictable and being undependable. And I think, unfortunately, the policy of the U.S., or the sclerotic decision making, that doesn't really seem to be very formalized at all, is pushing allies and partners to lean more toward predicting unreliability. And so what we've seen now, in drips and drabs over the last few months, for instance, the Saudis and the Pakistanis signed a new security agreement that, rumor has it, the Qataris and or the Turks might also join into. So you're seeing some of this, increased engagement at the, regional and sub-regional level across some of these partners. You're seeing some of these Gulf states, Saudi, the Qataris, the Emiratis, engage directly with Ukrainian drone manufacturers, because they've demonstrated great success in Ukraine to using drones against enemy adversary drones, and they're coming in now and signing 10-year agreements with these companies to come in and bolster their air defenses. So you're seeing countries take steps to address these immediate needs outside the purview of the U.S. Because I recall that, again, there is no stated formal U.S. position being conveyed to these key partners, because there are no ambassadors. So you don't have that coherent message of, hey, we're going to help you rebuild some of your air defenses. We're going to help you address some of the clear gaps that we've obviously noticed in the ability to counter these swarming drones and other things, because the U.S. is still scrambling a bit to one, replenish its own stocks of this, and two, it seems not to be tethered to a cohesive strategic vision that leads to sound policy. So these countries are kind of going out on their own in some cases, or finding ways to coordinate with themselves that uniquely excludes the United States, which is something we have not seen at this level for decades.
Mm. And I guess the final question simply is, there's a lot of emphasis on multipolarity. We're in a multipolar world. We're in spheres of influence. And while I think that the rate at which such a shift is happening, I think certainly we are seeing it happen in certain ways, and not at equal pace. But Jason, simply, well, to quote Mark Carney's emphasis of middle powers banding together, if there's this shift of the balance of power in the Middle East, if we've got these sort of two blocks emerging, what does that mean for US foreign policy in the Middle East, and how does it look in the next, say, 5-10 years?
Yeah, look, I think in the near term, the U.S. needs to, again, start to build its reliability bona fides, if you will. Again, it's one thing to have differing views on matters, or be circumspect about sharing certain technologies, or whatever some of these hurdles to increase security cooperation have been. But you need to be able to reinstill that when we say we're going to do something, then we're going to do it. And I think by doing that, and by, I think, helping to address some of these immediate needs of allies and partners in the region, particularly when it comes to air and missile defense going forward, I think that's an area where, from a defense and security standpoint, the U.S. needs to remain hyper focused on, in terms of both replenishing the stocks that have been lost, but also helping to rebuild a network that is more capable of preventing Iranian attacks, and in so doing, decreasing their leverage over time. Because I think we're in a phase now where Iran absolutely has the upper hand here with their asymmetric capabilities, but I don't think even they are looking really to the longer term and how they can exploit this now opportunity to benefit them, from a more of a financial or stability standpoint going forward. So I think we're seeing in the Gulf and throughout the Arab world, these states are going to, spend a lot on rebuilding their capabilities and in so diminishing some of Iran's capabilities. The question now remains what role the U.S. will have in helping that or expediting that process. So I think that from a defense standpoint needs to really be the focus here over these next 5 years or so.
Okay, well, that's a lot to think about there, Jason. And well, if you don't mind a bonus question, but
Sure.
can the United States win back favor? There's a lot of emphasis. Some policymakers like to believe that all has to happen is that we return to some normalcy post-Trump, be that Democrat or Republican, but more sort of traditional or whatever, moderate. Is that possible? Because I feel like there's a fundamental rupture now, at least in the transatlantic relationship. Not sure about the Gulf U.S. relationships. That is going to be harder to simply repair over.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's going to take time, and it's going to, I think, take dedicated effort on the part of U.S. policymakers going forward to again reestablish some degree of credibility among allies and partners, and be able to demonstrate that with real action and support. And again, we've been working with these partners. Anyone who's worked in government, you're engaging on a near, daily, if not daily, weekly basis with key partners and allies here in Washington. They can look at, who's sort of in charge, not just at senior most levels, but at the working level, who's involved in some of these policy decisions and deliberations, and understand the degree to which, we're serious and willing and able to move forward collectively. And I think a lot of that's been lost here in the last year and a half. And I think there is a way the U.S. can begin to rebuild some of that, but it's going to have to be, at least in the short term, I think, selective on key issues that are of mutual concern. Europe, that might be more difficult to do, but I think in this region, again, helping to take away the claws, so to speak, of Iran vis-a-vis some of these air and missile defense capabilities, I think is a way that can begin that process.
All right. Well, there you have it, everyone. Quite the complex point by which to end on. And Jason, in your thorough sort of breakdown analysis of what is happening, what shouldn't be happening, and what could happen or should happen as well going forward. Yeah, lots to chew on, I guess is the phrase I'd use. But everyone, for watching or listening, of course, do follow the show if you haven't already. Do leave a comment if you enjoyed it. Check out Jason's work. You'll find more about the Middle East Institute in this respective descriptions of both this audio and YouTube show, and we'll see you soon. But otherwise, well, take care out there, and hopefully some better news on the horizon. See you soon.